let other people jump in as they get here. So hello, everyone, and welcome. Everyone here knows this, but today the Executive and Artistic Director of NCCAkron is here. So thank you, Christy, for being here. So before we get started, if everyone could mute themselves, I'll mute myself as soon as I'm done talking, just to get rid of background noise and all of that stuff. If you do have questions or reflections throughout, we will take questions at the end so we can unmute ourselves then, but just so you don't lose questions or we'll address them as we go, you can drop them in the group chat and we will hit them as they come in. So with all of that being said, Christy, it is all you.
Oh, thank you. And I appreciate the invitation. It was especially special because many of the UA grad students have been in class with me. So I feel like they get to hear from me all the time, and I will try and come up with new anecdotes if I can, keep it fresh. But that means a lot to be invited into the space. So thank you all for having me and for doing this too. Quarantine series, loving the branding, the UA. I was like, oh yeah, you should get paid all the big bucks and great grades for that. I'm sure there's a check in the mail. One of the first prompts that you had provided me, Amy and Tessa, was what is NCCAkron doing to respond to COVID-19? And I took that a little bit philosophically, specifically responding to the word respond, because I think we all have in this moment, like when we work for an arts organization and it feels like, well, anything I do is not big enough, right? I'm not a first responder. I am not on the front lines. I have the privilege and opportunity to work from home. And so that definitely was some of my immediate response to the situation. We did have an artist on the ground when face-to-face instruction was suspended on that Tuesday, March 10th. We were expecting the Stephen Petronio company on that Saturday. And actually they were going to perform in Cleveland first and then migrate to Akron. And on Wednesday, Dance Cleveland and Playhouse Square, in accordance with Governor DeWine's directive, went ahead and canceled the performance. So the artist called and said, should we still come? If we come, if we keep our airline tickets as scheduled on Thursday, like, can you help put us up? And I'm really proud of our team, which we had just grown. Many of you know this. We had just expanded the team really starting in the fall. So we're sort of a new group, nothing like a crisis to bring a group together. And I really appreciate how they were able to act. We were able to get those 3 additional hotel nights in Akron and with our local Airbnb to make that happen. All of a sudden, we had to have a totally different transportation plan too. And we were able to still support the artist. So if it didn't feel like I could do anything that was going to make a difference on the front lines and with the health crisis our country was facing, I could at least be reassuring. I could at least be consistent for the artist. They came through and we had also had the conversation on campus because it was less than 10 people. So at that stage in COVID, it was okay for them to be in the space. We did employ new safety measures, just in terms of hygiene, extra wiping things down in the dance studio. And it's surprising to me how quickly that became the norm, because when Stephen and the dancers arrived, we gave them a tour then on that Friday. So this was Friday the 13th. Classes were not happening. We had gotten, our new measures in place the day before, gave him the tour, laid out where everything was. And the dancer said, well, how long have you been doing this? And we said, well, since yesterday. And they were like, oh, because it felt like already it was the norm. This was the new behavior. And we were trying to, keep it normal in that scenario. I think there's something about arts administration and what we learn as performers, excuse is how to perform in the face of a crisis. Maybe as a performer, you've had a bad day. Maybe you've gotten really bad news. Maybe family, loved ones have been going through something even in non-pandemic times. And yet the show goes on. You still have to go out there and perform. That may be the complete polar opposite from an emotional standpoint. So I felt some of that training kind of kicking in, holding the responsibility for the artists, for our team, but at the same time, trying to still employ new safety measures. Unfortunately, by that weekend, then when Governor DeWine said all bars and restaurants would be closing down, we knew it was not tenable because the artists were staying in hotels. What if they couldn't get food? What if they couldn't get drink? And they were also getting anxious as stretched that time was being in a residency place and space. They had friends and loved ones at home in New York. Things were really starting to escalate and become more public. And so they wanted to get home while they still could. And so they did leave on Monday, March 16th. Simultaneously, we had an artist that was supposed to come in from San Francisco. Nicole Claymoon, in her embodiment project, was going to be here for the tail end of class instruction, but really most of spring break. So she was going to be around when the artists weren't going to be anyways. There's another corner of the country. She was coming out to do a technical residency, and her work was supposed to premiere at YBCA, the Yerba Buena Center for the Arts in San Francisco, in April. And she was having a real moment of frustration because YBCA said, well, we are definitely suspending operations for the month of March, but we haven't decided about April yet. And because we've suspended operations, we can't tell you when we'll make that decision. So it's a different psychological sort of trauma to go through as an emerging artist, as someone who has worked so hard and achieved grants and residencies and opportunities to get to this moment, and to feel that if you don't take it now, will you get it again? There's it's like we're fighting with our training and that ingrained, the show must go on. So really, it was 3 or 4 days that I was talking to her on a regular basis to talk about, like, okay, what are you getting in terms of information from YBCA? Okay, you don't have that, but she's also going, well, what's best practices in this scenario? I said, there are no best practices. I appreciate she was asking lots of questions, though. As a newly incorporated, she'd been fiscally sponsored for the last almost decade. As a newly incorporated organization, she was really trying to take care of her cast, who was not on full-time salaries, who were on a project basis. And so it felt helpful to be in a scenario to work with the artist, to go ahead and talk about, well, do you want to advance them for work that they may likely do for you in July, right? If it's not a cash flow issue right now, and you want to have a reciprocal relationship with your contract employees, if you think you might not do this tech residency until July, is that something within your purview? I happen to also know she was working with a very flexible funder who was open to that. So if she said, I'm going to pay them to rehearse now, I would have paid them to rehearse anyways. It's just a question of when the rehearsal will happen. Ultimately, we decided, and I really encouraged her, even without a firm no from YBCA, because this was maybe a day before Nicole was supposed to fly out herself. But I said, you know what? I don't think y'all should travel. Flights, of course, were still happening, but I said, we're going to postpone. We're going to do this right. Because the real concern, as things had already been escalating in San Francisco, was what might they bring with them if they had not been safe or had been exposed. And similarly, if they can't get home, if things had gotten to a point, it's different when I talk about driving distance to Chicago or Philadelphia or New York. It was that much more dire if they couldn't actually drive home and maybe would get stuck in Akron. And we had to consider at that point, then it's at a higher expense. Right now, it becomes a cash flow issue because they are incurring additional expense for per diems, for hotels that are outside of what maybe NCC Akron can provide and what the artist had budgeted. So it was really hard to make that decision. And I think it was equal parts emotion, maybe even more so emotional than it was financial. When in the moment, you're just trying to be as decisive as possible. So that was our first response, maybe the first week afterwards. But I'll leave it to you to guide where you'd like to go as far as follow-up questions or after that. But that was our first response to COVID-19.
Yeah, Cam put in our group chat for people who don't keep the group chat open, like I don't. On normal occasions, I'll read things out loud so everybody's in the loop. But Cam was just echoing how you were saying that we're fighting with our training and the ingrained, the show must go on mentality. And you touched on this, but I kind of want to hear more. Do you think that's a mentality that we need to change as arts administrators, as performers? Do you think that's a good mentality in a time like this where we just keep pushing? What are your thoughts?
Yeah. Yes, and. I think the other opportunity, many of you have likely heard that I talk about NCC Akron's unique role in the ecosystem, that we didn't have to deal with canceling and thousands of ticket subscribers or an entire season of 52 weeks of work or different performances coming through. That is people who are immediately dealing with crisis management and crisis relief. So after taking care of our immediate artists, I very much was thinking about, so how are we going to rebound? I'm purposely using the term rebound and not rebuild. If we can acknowledge that, and we use this as one of our group agreements in class, that we live and work in imperfect systems. And the idea of rebuild, I think, operates on an assumption that everything was great, whereas a rebound is, where do we go next? And that may be taking some of the things that worked before and some of the things that didn't. So this idea of training or the show must go on, I think it was psychological as a performer. And also, we're scrappy. Arts organizations, like, we get the job done. We apply for the grants. We don't get as much money as we ask for. We still do the thing. We still make those anyways. So I was like, oh, both been our blessing and our curse. And this was a moment to say, like, we don't have to do everything like we just did. A lot of people found solace in putting everything online. I equally respect the people who have been like, you know what, I'm going to slow my roll on that, and I'm not going to put everything online. You don't have to see everything that I've done. Kind of really pacing ourselves through that. Where I think that our training is a real challenge is what it was the same challenge before COVID. It's just hyper attuned even more so now. It's talking about institutional behavior, right? Talking about our larger arts and cultural organizations who, like the Titanic, it's going to take them much more time to shift an inner zeitgeist, to shift the ethos of an organization. And I've been reminded of Nina Simon, and particularly, I love her book, The Art of Relevance. She had initiated a blog, Museum 2.0, but I got to hear her speak once. And this was when she was running the Santa Cruz Museum. And this was a decade ago. And at that point, the kind of shifts that she was talking about, she said, oh my God, we're going to do a lock-in. And we're going to encourage members from our community to draw on the walls. And maybe we'll do an event. And it doesn't have to happen in our museum, but we'll go ahead and have a service that's out on the beach, because this was Santa Cruz, like beach culture. How local is that? And it sounded so inspiring and amazing. But the pragmatist in me had to raise my hand at this big event. And I said, I just have to say, like, how did you bring your board along? How did you bring your staff along, right? Because that's really what leadership requires, is not just having a good idea, but how you can execute it, how you can get buy-in from members and your stakeholders. And I'll never forget this. This is why it reminded me. She said, because it was close your doors or we have to do something new. So even in quote unquote normal times, right, it takes a lot more effort for our cultural institutions to do something big and bold outside of the norm. If everyone's offering a free night on Thursday nights, great. If everyone does, a fundraiser, and maybe they have some nuances about their gala that makes it their specific to their organization. But it's a lot easier to do those quote unquote best practices as far as how we operate from day to day and not take the risk to try something new. So my hope as we move forward as a field is that people don't try to recapture what was quote unquote normal before. And we can do some of those same things again, but always question, is that still where I want to go? Is that the normal I want to return to? And hopefully we'll get some new, really groundbreaking ideas that aren't in the crisis management. Let's just get it online anyways. But really thinking about what the future will look like. How will it change?
So the other question, just lines with into the like what's happening right now. You mentioned that you have been supporting your artists financially. Is there any other ways that they've requested support or that you found that support them or to motivate them or however else that?
Yeah, I mean, once again, from our position of privilege, and we already focus on craft and choreography, we were already working on a couple of things that were planned this spring, and I'm pleased we were able to continue with them. We have two different book projects that we were starting a collaboration with the University of Akron Press, and one highlighting, telling stories, I think identifying, working with artists and saying, like, we see you, we still want to tell your story, and not just your pandemic story, but like, let's step back for the 30,000-foot view, but also recognizing that we could create jobs. So specifically working with artists that maybe don't work at a publication or at an academic institution. They likely are also freelancers. So to be able to engage them as a way forward, that was a small minor adjustment in the strategy. How do we prioritize who we want to employ and work with? With artists themselves, the other thing that was in play was actually something Jennifer Edwards was working on. We wanted to survey all of the artists that we had served to date. And we were going to do this anyways. But one of the things that became clearer in our strategies from some of the feedback we were getting with board members, both pre-COVID, but it felt that much more affirming and important after we went to shelter in place, is we offered $20 gift cards to everyone who completed a survey. And I'll tell you, like, what continued to just blow my mind was even in these dire moments where artists and some people that said, oh no, you can keep it. And I was like, we let us give you money. We want to give you money. I mean, the generosity of our field, for better or worse, right? That's both one of those, like, the show must go on, and the generosity and altruism that we thrive off of, that social capital. But I hope we don't just fall too far on one end of the spectrum or the other. We have to balance those things because they are limited resources. And then as we move forward, we have a couple programs this summer, and I've had conversations with artists that said, who knows, you may be okay to travel in one state, but you can't travel in another state. So how do we need to think about this differently? And some of that is very affirming. So one of the things is we focus a lot on relationships and providing space for knowledge exchange. That doesn't have to be a one-off, right? It's not the same as trying to put on a show for one night only. So we're starting to have conversations on, like, well, what would they want to do virtually? What what if we looked at this residency so that we could also support them in some way financially? Maybe it happens 2, 3, 4 times over the course of a year instead of 4 days in Akron together this summer. We don't know yet what will be safe for everyone to do, but we're starting to explore those scenarios. The last thing that I'll offer, because I saw a question pop up and I'll rely on you to read it, is one of the things that we were exploring in our strategic plan. I don't see the third National Center for Choreography coming along anytime soon, right? It took, the first one came about in 2005. It took almost another 10 years before the second one came along. And particularly now, how many new things will get built in a post-COVID world and that of our size and magnitude and resources, not so certain. We were already starting to ask the question, like, what of our programs need to happen in Akron and which ones could happen elsewhere? And if they did, to what degree? Like, how would that be helpful? How would it be different or the same? Almost thinking like what franchising would look like, as well as replicating some of our practices and activities. And so that the opportunity, knowing that we had that had been kind of in the back of my mind, but it felt that much more important to really explore those opportunities now in light of these.
So Tessa, question, have you seen any innovations during this time that you do want to keep when we're no longer in crisis management mode?
Totally. I don't know about y'all, but particularly with like all of the different conference calling, and we had access to WebEx before COVID-19. We just didn't use it on campus. In one moment, I feel like, I'm living in the future. I'm like a part of the Jetsons. And then the next moment, I'm like, I don't know how that technology works. I'm a total Luddite. So when I do see some really cool and exciting things, not just living room dance, that is a fun, social, like let it out, but dance church. And I've shared that with some of our community. Kate Wallach came out in 2017 as part of our dancing lab, female choreographer artist. Dance church is advertised as the dance party you wish you had been at the night before. It normally takes place with a live DJ. The instructor, there's no front. The instructor has a Madonna mic on or a Britney mic, depending on your generation, and guides everyone through a high-level series of follow the leader. And the one rule is that you can't stop moving for 90 minutes. Immediately, in less than a week, they translated that to an online live stream experience. And I have to think it's because they were ready to do that with some of the technology. Not all classes are lending themselves that way. What excites me about what that might mean in the future outside of crisis management, Tessa, is it totally expanded the possibility of capacity. When these classes roll 2, 3 times a week, they have a couple thousand people that are logging in. I don't know that I've ever taken a class with 1,000 people or would want to live, right? I need my space, what's going on, but that sense that people were like, oh, this particular style. So how will some of these quick crisis ideas affect and inform how we think about revenue streams, about capacity, opportunities in the future? Because now we've been invited to think outside of our formal or brick and mortar walls.
Dominic just came with a question. He said, how do you think COVID-19 will affect the in-studio practices or eventual artistic products of the artists around the nation in post-COVID-19 America?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's what also feels so emotionally and personally threatening, especially for dance, although I think it's similar for music too. I was just listening to someone who said, you know what, an orchestra needs to be within a certain distance of each other when they're playing together. And so we might be able to stage the audience every other seat, but you can't necessarily do that sort of adjustment with the orchestra. Dance, similarly, not all dance artists work in close proximity. Partnering is very innate and germane to some. Um, so, I think there's a real question of when it will be safe for us to go back into those in-studio practices, even if as things adjust and maybe we can go to bars again, or we say you can do performances, but they can't be for more than 50 people. Are our studios and spaces prepared from an OSHA standpoint to keep things healthy, to keep things safe? A lot of times in larger institutions, they're like, well, we do a deep cleaning like once a season or once a week. And I mean, the elevated level of cleaning, even in our own houses. I don't know about y'all. It's like, oh my gosh, like, how will I do this differently moving forward too, now that I'm home and doing laundry every day? COVID privilege. So I'm really curious, and what's been interesting to follow, maybe just to acknowledge with a small footnote, for those that haven't worked inside of dance organizations. So if you aren't working on a project basis, you may have your dance artists on 40, 50, 52-week contracts. And with that idea of contracts, I really applaud those companies that said, like, well, we're going to pay our dancers right now in this moment, regardless. You're right, because there were a lot of other organizations that have decided to furlough or lay off. And the idea of, well, we're going to pay them anyways. I know that some of those choreographers, they're still rehearsing via Zoom. They'll do this with the Brady Bunch times 10, to including themselves, maybe a rehearsal director, all of their dancers, and they're choreographing, literally watching people just like we do right now in each other's spaces. There was an article on the Washington Post earlier this week. The Mark Morris Dance Group is doing this. Never thought I would see the day if I was just, I know we're recording this, but I mean, he is a classicist, right? So the idea of choreographing and the screen, and it's for a work that they were planning to premiere this summer at the Tanglewood Music Festival that has not been canceled yet. We'll see how that runs. But instead, they're also going to premiere a film version of the work on May 28th online, as far as a live stream. That's different. That's something that wouldn't have happened before. And I think about that too, like when social media first came up. So we didn't even have a health crisis as a form of destruction. But when social media first come up, all the institutions were like, well, we're not going to give away that content. That's the content that we save for our donors. We're not going to just post any of those interviews. It took a couple of years before that became more normalized across our institutions, because they saw the value of that and that it didn't have to operate from a place of scarcity and protectiveness, but something that could open up. So if there's anything with COVID, and I'm a realistic optimist at best, we know this. But if there's anything, I think it accelerated some of those needs for change, some of the clenching, because the urge to create or the opportunity to be creative, that's one thing I've learned from working with artists, is particularly at NCCAkron, because we're like, you can do anything. Well, at the same time, that can be just as paralyzing, as opposed to like, well, you can only do this, or you can do anything, but it's within this space. So I think that there's a couple of those things that'll be at play. It's not as doomsday, as there will be a lot that's lost across the field, I think, too. But I'm optimistic that we will gain a lot more that we can't even imagine yet, creatively.
That actually segues really well to one of the other questions that I had. So how has coming up with creative ways to continue engaging the dance community expanded NCCAkron's vision for what the full potential of the creative process in dance could be?
Mm. So, one of the things that we had tried 2 years ago was where we realized that we could be a space not only for choreographers to experiment, but also a place for dance audiences to experiment. In trying to fill one of those cracks in the foundation for dance, it was like if we're just helping new work get made, but there isn't an audience or an appetite, a demand for what we're helping get made, then how are we being complicit in a broken system? So it was actually with last week's guest, Nikisha Moore-Denson, as our co-architect with a brand new social experiment idea called Dance Club. And that happened over 4 months and encouraged people who self-selected to engage with dance once a month. And it was kind of like you would organize a book club where it was social. We had a meal together. We would talk about dance. It was not necessarily dance 101, like you need to know and understand the history of US dance in order to be smart enough to get this performance experience this weekend. But rather encouraged people to stay curious and to articulate their experience. They didn't just pass judgment, I liked it, didn't like it, but that they really were in an environment that they could say, I don't know, or I thought it was a love quarrel, but maybe it's a mother-daughter thing, that they could sort of live in that space. We were planning on reinstituting it this summer in conjunction with the Heinz Pole Summer Dance Festival here in Akron, and had already lined up Spring Healing. I saw her on here somewhere as an intern. And so one of the first things that I did right after we had settled Stephen and Nicole as our artists is I reached out to Spring and I was like, would you be interested in interning with us sooner? Because now it feels more urgent if we could do some sort of social experiment to go ahead and make a virtual dance club experience happen. So Spring has been working on researching that. We've engaged with our past dance clubbers to do a survey and understand their level of interest. And then, hey, Nicole Mullet's on here too. We're going to be reaching out to especially the Akron community and inviting them to sign up for a dance club experience. It's going to have to take a different format than we did offline, but it's something that this is something we can do. Like we can still be a resource for artists and for audiences who are trying to process this new onslaught of intel and information that's online. Because we know, like, not just because you put the performances online doesn't mean people are watching. How are they responding to them? So we can be one of those sort of intermediaries and create a space and opportunity that they can connect to talk about that too.
Jennifer Edwards posted a question. She says, I've been reading that as cities in China begin to relax house arrest, that many folks experienced fear of re-entering society. Do you feel dance and performing arts or artists can play a role in helping to reassure or engage people in taking risks, in touching and being together? If so, how can we dream this into being?
Mm. Ooh, big stretch. Okay. Thanks, Jen Ed. Yes, I feel that's always been the role of dance in the performing arts as a reflection of how society and culture, our moment in time is responding to something. Some of it may result be related a little bit back to Dom's question about like the effect on InStudio Practice or what work might be getting made. One of the things there's Balanchine's Agon, which I think premiered in the 1950s. George Balanchine, preeminent ballet choreographer. That was one of the first works he made after taking a year off because his wife, a prima ballerina at the time, Tanya Leclerc, I think, had suffered polio. And that moment, I mean, he took a year off of making work. And she suffered polio because she didn't accept the vaccine before they went on a European tour. That was one of the downsides. That first work that he made was is sort of acknowledged and renowned because it features a mixed race partnering between Arthur Mitchell and Diana Adams. Arthur Mitchell is a preeminent Black male ballet dancer, and Diana Adams was a white female prima ballerina. So much of that moment, right? You could just respond to seeing a Black man and a white woman dancing together on stage. So much of that moment now, with a little bit more hindsight and research, well, Balanchine's wife was getting work at treatment facilities, which were in the South, which did embrace some racist practices because people thought that Black people were immune to polio. So most of the caregivers were people of color. And so some of the partnering, the manipulation that's seen on stage in that particular work is a reflection of the society of the time and the place. That, with the advantage of hindsight, that's one of the ways I think and that we could see how dance and the performing arts is going to raise awareness. How do people plug into that? Is it about the fear of touch or proximity to each other? How many COVID-19 inspired works are we going to see that are really trying to also shine a light on the inequities that this entire experience has revealed on US culture and our society? There are many different ways that artists could plug into that. So I certainly see that will reveal itself over time. I mean, we still see people who make work about 9/11, people who make work about World War II, about civil rights movements. These are such deep human experiences. I think that they'll continue to be fodder for the stage. As far as what organizations can do in a broader way, I think part of it is habit and culture. So, for example, if you've always done things inside those proverbial four walls, is that still where you want to do things? Does it never assume that that's the normal you have to return to? I see some cultural organizations that are trying to expand the Balch Street Theater here in West Hill, Akron, is available for first responders who may contract COVID that need some place to recover and they cannot go home into their communities. That's a whole community center that lays home to a couple of different nonprofits, including the New World Performance Lab. That's how they are, moving to the front lines to be able to work in this time period. I think that I hope there are more institutions that are trying to figure out ways to do this sort of recovery work that you brought up in your question, Jened.
So Tess and I had one question, and then if anyone has anything to drop in the chat, by all means, you still have time. So what has inspired you in particular to stay true to NCCAkron's mission during all of the chaos?
It's what inspires me even in less chaotic times. It is the artist. It's the conversations. I've been serving on a grant panel during this same time, and it was excruciating, but also felt that it was more necessary than ever because all the grants were written before the March 2nd, before the grant deadline. So to read so many projects that you now know are possibly in peril, that may not get made or may not get made for another 10 to 18 to 24 months, was a really taxing emotional experience, but it's also what continued to give me hope about why we do this work. And so as an extension of that, the people, even with my own team at NCCAkron that we had a weekly team meeting. Some of us worked remotely anyways, even pre-COVID, now that we're all working remotely. To be able to offer that on a consistent basis, the interaction and accountability among the team that, initially reached out and said like, hey, if this is not what you can do right now, that is fine. Like, this is a moment to opt out. And everyone's like, nope, let's go. All right, then, like that helps me feel that I'm not alone in this. Whereas a lot of people were talking about working remotely and working from home. And for the first 3 years, that was my experience. I used to tell people, because I was traveling so much 2 or 3 times a month, that, well, wherever I am, that is the center. I've submitted grants from airplanes and financial reports and held board meetings in local libraries, wherever I could find quiet space. And so this felt immediately familiar to be sheltering at home alone, but I don't feel that I'm really alone in it. And so that sense of team is what I think will continue to get me through here, and as a reminder for where we go forward with NCCAkron.
Cam posted something, but it's just about how amazing you are and how wonderful and thankful we all are to have you as a professor and at those things. So it's true.
That's very kind.
Likes your shoes. So last call for questions. As I'm talking, if I get another one, I'll interrupt myself and read it out loud. But Christy, thank you so much for being with us. Yeah, Cam pretty much said everything about how wonderful and awesome you are. So just read that whenever you need to pick me up, because we all feel like that. So in theory, this whole meeting was recorded. Last time I tried to record it, it didn't work. So hopefully that happened this time. And if it did, this whole thing will be posted on the Dance Theater and Arts Administration website. So if you want to go back and listen or missed something, feel free to go back and listen to it. Our next talk will be next week. We're still pegging down the date, so keep your eyes on social media for that. You should all also be on the list to get emails now. So when that date gets pinned down, you guys will be the first to know. So stay safe, everyone, and hopefully we'll see each other in person again soon. And if not, we'll see everyone next week.
Yes, thank you, Amy. Thank you, Tessa. Thanks for having me, y'all.
Thanks, Christy. You rock.
Oh, bye, guys.
Bye.